A reading from Revelation. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne, saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. I have a problem that causes some conflict, at least, every time I gather with my family. It's the same problem that has me a little bit anxious about the final episode of Game of Thrones this evening. You see, I am really drawn to a depressing story. And easy, happy endings, I find myself at least a little bit skeptical of them. I can't seem to help it. A good, sad story just seems to tell the truth without making it easily digestible in any way. And this always makes choosing a movie with my family a little more difficult than it should be. Give me a romantic movie that shows what's beautiful about love. Not that it's always easy, but that it's worth risking the anguish, the heartbreak, the frustration. Love is more powerful than those risks. Give me an action movie that shows the futility of violence and leaves our hero crushed in some way at least. Jon Snow with a single scratch on his cheek and a clean conscience just isn't going to do it for me. And yet, our faith proclaims an audacious message of hope. Here in Revelation chapter 21, we read a beautiful vision of the ending. Heaven and earth are created anew, and a new Jerusalem descends in which God will dwell with mortal humans. God will move in next door and comfort us and wipe our tears. Death is eradicated. Mourning and weeping and pain are dissolved. We've skipped to the final page of God's story, and we find this happy ending with all things made new and all people children of God. Maybe, like me, you want to embrace this ending, but you look around and you find yourself a little bit skeptical. Now, you probably don't need any help from me to read a passage from the book of Revelation with just a little bit of apprehension. Revelation can be a difficult book for us to interpret and take seriously because we're familiar with other attempts to read it as sort of a textual crystal ball. We're steeped in a culture that looks at this apocalyptic book as something more like a source of fortune telling about who will turn and who will burn. Or maybe you simply share my distrust of easy, happily ever after. But some of us listened to this reading from Revelation this morning with significant skepticism. A new heaven and a new earth? Death will be no more? These statements seem to belong in a sci-fi Netflix original, not in our sacred texts. Solving the problem of human mortality sounds like fiction for sure, even if that's how your favorite movies end. Perhaps these hopes seemed possible in the 2nd century when John was writing his Revelation, but we're within a couple decades of what scientists warn us is a point of no return for this heaven and this earth. You see, the earth, which is our common home with all humanity and all created things, is at a turning point. Technological innovations and corporations have brought about the degradation of our home. Global warming barely even hints at the challenges we face. As the climate changes for this earth and sky, the sea will not be done away with, as Revelation says, but the waters will be so acidic that nothing can live in their depths. We're seeing this already in the Mediterranean, where the water is absorbing CO2 and has become acidic enough that mollusks and clams and coral can't calcify their hard exteriors. Our scorched soil often leaves the least of these left to deal with the consequences. Right here in our own city in West Dallas, there was an active lead smelter from the 1930s to 1980s, and there are still areas where you can find batteries and lead chips in the dirt. For years, this part of our city had higher rates of mental illness and violent behavior, things often correlated with lead exposure. As you can imagine, it's generally those who can't afford to move across town that are left to deal with the consequences. And in the past couple of years, even as neighborhoods have been revitalized and cleaned up, there is not housing for the longtime residents of that area. It's all well and good to imagine a new heaven and a new earth as the glorious end of all things. But what are we left to do with this home that we have now? It sounds a bit hopeless, I know. And many of us need no reminder that endings can seem hopeless. The cold side of the bed may remind you every morning that the one you love is gone. Or every liquor store you pass may remind you of the addiction that has left your family in tatters. Or one look at your online banking or your online retirement portfolio just might prove that you'll never find peace in this world. And this, my friends, this is why we read this text from Revelation. This message of hope, however naive and impossible it may seem, conveys power for our present as well as our future. You see, John's audience in this book of Revelation also needed no reminder that endings are not always happy. For the most part, it seems, these were people that lived on the edge of society. They lived as Jews and Jesus followers mostly under the Roman Empire, and they were not the select few that benefited from Rome's power. Instead, they were those consistently trying to avoid the crushing power of Rome. They were people of meager economic status, and they knew the risks of loving Jesus, because in those decades following Jesus' death, emperors like Nero and Domitian had occasionally found it helpful to use Christians as scapegoats, so that there was occasional persecution and, more consistently, a risk of being pushed out of economic and social life in the area ruled by Rome. Our public radio station, KERA, has done a couple iterations of the series One Crisis Away, in which they explore the stories of people here in North Texas who are on the financial brink. These are people that we don't normally think about as being impoverished, but they're one crisis or one unexpected expense from falling into the grip of poverty. One example was a single mother of two, living in a suburban 2-bedroom apartment, working full-time as a preschool teacher, but every summer filing for unemployment when her income dropped. Getting further and further behind, eventually, she had to file for bankruptcy. This is perhaps a helpful way to imagine those people that would have originally read the book of Revelation. They probably weren't hiding out in caves all the time, hiding from people who were hunting their lives, but instead, they were people that lived on the edge. Their life was tenuous and soul-crushing. The people initially reading the book of Revelation had a daily reality that proved that the empire and the whim of the one on the throne was the ultimate power in their world. We have to remember the literary genre of apocalypse, and we have to remember this audience when we read this book of Revelation. For these people, this text is an imaginative, happy ending to their world, while realistically, they probably knew how things were going to end. Rome wins. They always do. And people like them, the small, poor people, will eventually be crushed by a society that makes the wealthy richer and the poor poorer. But this apocalyptic book reveals, as well as imagines, a hopeful end. God is the force far more powerful than Rome, and Jesus will turn out to be the true conqueror, ruling as a lamb instead of a ruthless potentate. And in the world ruled by the Lamb, we will see a new heaven and a new earth coming down, a new society in which death and weeping and mourning and pain are gone. These things will be done. This beautiful vision of hope isn't simply about decoding the proper theology of the eschaton, the last things, but this vision is about having something to live for. Rome may be crushing you, but God wins in the end. You may be risking a lot for your faith in Jesus, but God is eternally faithful. A hopeful vision like this can indeed change a life. One psychiatrist writes that hope is often the only thing between humans and the abyss. He says that a person who has hope can endure and overcome just about anything, but the problem is that hope lies at the emotional level, sort of in our gut responses, and that it can be quite difficult to convince our thinking selves to actively hope. And this is why we read this book of Revelation in our sacred texts and in our worship this morning. Perhaps by reading and reciting this vision of the end, our imagination can spark hope in us. Perhaps these words can be all things new in us and be performative as God creates new things in you and in me. I believe that God is making all things new, and if I keep meditating on scriptures like this one and on the faithfulness of God, maybe my belief can grow into hope and change my life. So there it is. Believe in a happy ending because it will make you happier and more psychologically resilient. That's good news, isn't it? Yes, I think that is good news. And it's only part of the story. If you're entertaining a little bit of skepticism about happy endings with me this morning, then I think we need to go one step further. Is the answer really that endings don't actually matter? That it's simply imagining a hopeful end and giving us the strength to muddle through that matters? Partly yes, but hope also empowers us to become part of the hopeful end itself. This vision in our text this morning says that God is making all things new. This is the end to which we hope. And truth be told, God's creative work of making things has actually never ceased. There's an ancient tradition that says we are living in the 8th day of creation. St. Augustine interpreted Jesus' resurrection on a Sunday, the 8th day and the first day, if you will, as a symbol that we are living in God's creation beyond the 7th day of Sabbath rest. And this simple image of creation continued beyond the 7 days of Genesis 1 is actually quite consistent with the creation story we have in Genesis 2. You see, that second creation story portrays God as a gardener who tills the earth and who plants Eden and places humans in that Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it, and presumably to make life flourish all over the planet. In this tradition, part of our empowered and hopeful living is that we become co-creators with God. God is making all things new in part through us as we continue that creative work on this 8th day. So when we read this happy ending, this ending is not simply pie in the sky or cities in the sky. This is a hopeful vision of the end that calls us to begin making that end a reality even today. I can't hear this story of hope without thinking of Samira Izadi Page, the founder of our mission partner Gateway of Grace. Many of you have heard her story. Years ago, her life was at risk in her own home country, but she had hope that she could escape with her family. Enough hope that she fled on foot to Turkey through the Taurus Mountains and multiple feet of snow with her 2 children. And hope carried her through as she was smuggled to Mexico with less than $500 and no documentation. She waded across the Rio Grande and eventually received asylum here in a Dallas County courtroom. Samira's hope gave her the strength to resiliently press on. But not only that. Today, Samira leads one of the largest organizations in North Texas providing resettlement services for refugees. By locating and furnishing housing, assisting with acculturation, and providing language and job training, Samira has devoted her life to co-creating a new world for refugees here in our city. God is indeed making all things new, friends. And God has invited us to work alongside, wiping tears, preserving the soil and the earth around us, and creating peace. So that one day we may look around and see a new city and say, death is no more. Mourning and crying and pain are no more, for the first things have passed away. Amen.